Celestine was not the kind of woman who talked about herself much. If you asked the other staff at the estate about her, they would tell you she was reliable. They would tell you she was quiet. They would tell you that in 11 years of working there, she had never once been late, never once called in sick without good cause, and never once made her problems anybody else's business. That was just who she was. The kind of person who showed up, did the work, and kept moving. The kind of person the world tends to take for granted precisely because they never stop long enough to demand anything different. She was 46 years old, and she had the kind of face that had seen real life. Not hard in a bitter way, just settled. Like someone who had been through enough to know that most things pass and that the ones that don't, you simply learn to carry. She had been carrying things for a long time. Since her husband passed 8 years ago from an illness that came fast and left no room for preparation, she had been the only one holding everything together. 3 children. A sister back home who needed help every month. A job that paid steadily but not generously. And a life that asked more of her than it gave back most days without apology. She lived in the staff quarters at the back of the main house of Greystone Estate. A grand property sitting on the edge of a town that felt quieter than it looked. Her room was small, but she kept it neat. A photograph of her children on the nightstand. A small lamp she had brought from her old apartment. A Bible with a cracked spine that had been her mother's before it was hers. She did not have much space, but she had made it feel like hers, which was its own kind of accomplishment when you spend your life living inside someone else's world. The estate itself was beautiful in the way that old money tends to be. Wide grounds, tall trees, a long driveway lined with stones that had to be cleared every autumn. Celestine knew every corner of that house, every cabinet that stuck, every floorboard that creaked in the east hallway, every window that rattled when the wind came from the north. 11 years of learning a place will do that. It becomes part of you whether you intend it to or not. She managed the household quietly and completely, overseeing the cleaning schedule, coordinating with the cook, making sure everything ran the way her employer expected without anyone having to ask twice. She was good at her work. Not just competent, actually good. The kind of good that comes from genuine attention and genuine care, not just habit. But the part of her day that belonged entirely to herself, the 30 minutes that no one scheduled and no one could take from her, happened every morning before any of it began. Before the household woke up. Before the phone started and the doors opened and the needs of the day lined up waiting for her. She would rise at 5, sometimes a few minutes before, dress quickly in the dark, and step outside into whatever weather the morning had decided to bring. Then she would walk. The trail that ran behind the estate and curved along the edge of Greystone Woods was something she had discovered in her first year there and claimed quietly as her own. It was not a marked trail, not something on any map, just a worn path through the grass and into the trees that someone, years before her, had walked enough times to leave a trace. She had simply followed it one morning out of curiosity and never stopped. In those 30 minutes, she did not listen to music or podcasts or anything at all. She just walked and let her mind do whatever it needed to do. Sometimes she prayed. Sometimes she thought about her children. Sometimes she thought about nothing in particular and let the sound of the birds and the wind in the branches fill up the space instead. It was the only time in her day when she was not actively solving something, managing something, or holding something together for someone else. Those 30 minutes were hers. She protected them the way you protect the things that keep you sane. That particular Tuesday morning was cold. The kind of cold that arrives in the early weeks of the season before people are fully ready for it. When the air still smells like the tail end of something warmer, but the temperature has already moved on without waiting for anyone to catch up. She had pulled on an extra layer before heading out, A dark jacket she wore most mornings at this time of year, zipped up to the collar. Her breath made small clouds in the air as she walked. The trail was familiar enough that her feet knew it without her having to think about it. She passed the old fence post that leaned at an angle on the left side. She passed the cluster of birch trees that stood close together like they were keeping a secret. She passed the spot where she had once startled a deer so badly that it had frozen for a full 3 seconds before bolting, which had made her laugh out loud alone in the woods, like a woman with no cares at all. She was thinking about her youngest child that morning. There was a school presentation happening that day, one that her child had been nervous about all week. And Celestine had spent time the night before sitting at the small table in her room, going over notes together over a phone call, her voice low so as not to disturb the rest of the house. She had ended the call by saying, with complete confidence, that everything was going to go just fine. She believed it. She always believed in her children, even when they struggled to believe in themselves. That was part of the job, too. The most important part. She was somewhere in the middle of thinking about this when something pulled her attention sideways. It was not a sound exactly. Or maybe it was, but too faint and too brief to identify clearly. More like a disturbance in the quiet. A wrongness in the air that her body registered before her mind caught up. She slowed her pace without deciding to. Her eyes moved toward the right side of the trail, past the immediate line of trees and into the deeper shadow, where the branches grew thicker and the morning light had not yet reached. She stopped walking entirely. She stood very still and listened. Nothing for a moment. Just the wind moving through the upper branches and a bird somewhere far above doing its early morning routine. She almost kept going. She told herself later, many times, that she almost kept going. Her mind had already begun to form the thought that it was nothing, that she was tired and reading too much into ordinary forest sounds, that she needed to finish her walk and get back and start the day. But her feet did not move. Something held her right there on that trail, some instinct she could not name and did not try to. And after another moment, she stepped off the path and moved toward the shadows between the trees. She pushed through a low branch with her forearm, then another, her feet finding uneven ground beneath the leaves. It was darker in there, the trees close enough together that the sky almost disappeared above her. She moved carefully, watching where she stepped, and then she looked up from the ground and saw it. Saw him. A man, slumped against the wide base of a large oak tree, his body still, his head dropped forward so that his face was hidden. Her first thought was that he was dead. Her second thought, arriving almost immediately after, was that his chest was moving. Barely, but moving. She did not scream. She did not run. She stood there for exactly one breath, long and slow, and then she moved toward him. Because that was who Celestine was. That was who she had always been. When something needed doing, she did it. When someone needed help, she helped. She did not wait to see if someone more qualified was coming. She did not calculate what it might cost her. She just moved. And that movement, that one instinctive step forward in the cold and the dark and the silence of those woods, was about to change both of their lives in ways that neither of them could have possibly imagined when the morning began. She moved through the leaves and the broken branches carefully, her eyes fixed on the man slumped against the tree, her mind already shifting into the kind of focused calm that she had developed over years of handling things that most people would have fallen apart over. She had not planned for this morning to go this way. Nobody ever plans for something like this. But there she was, alone in the cold shadow of those trees, with a man who needed help and no one else around to give it. She closed the distance between them quickly and crouched down, getting low enough to see his face properly for the first time. He was older, somewhere in his 60s, she guessed. His face was pale beneath a layer of dirt, and what looked like dried mud that had crusted along his jaw and the side of his temple. There was a small cut above his eyebrow, not deep, but it had bled enough to leave a dark trail down the side of his face that had long since dried. His lips were cracked and dry the way lips get when a body has not had water in too long. She took all of this in quickly, the way you take inventory when there is no time to be slow about it. Then she pressed 2 fingers firmly against the side of his neck, just below the jaw, and held them there. His pulse was there, uneven and slower than she would have liked, but present. He was alive. She exhaled once, sharp and quiet, and then she got to work. She looked at his arms first. They were pulled behind him around the back of the tree, which was why his posture looked so wrong, why his body was slumped the way it was rather than simply leaning. His wrists were bound with rope. Thick rope, not the thin decorative kind, but the heavy kind, the kind used for serious work. And it had been tied tight enough that even in the low light she could see where it had pressed into his skin. His ankles were tied together in front of him with the same rope, a long piece of it running from his wrists around the base of the tree and then forward to his feet, keeping him locked in place against the trunk. Whoever had done this had known what they were doing. The knots were not sloppy. They were deliberate. She sat back on her heels for just a moment and looked around the immediate area, turning her head slowly in every direction. Nothing. No movement. No sound that did not belong to the woods. No sign of anyone else having been there recently, except for a patch of flattened grass a few feet away that suggested people had stood there for some time. Her heart was beating hard, but her hands were steady. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her phone. She dialed emergency services first, before anything else, and when the operator answered, she spoke clearly and without panic, giving the location as precisely as she could. Behind Greystone Estate, north side of the woods, off the main trail, roughly 100 yards in, near a cluster of large oaks. She described what she was seeing. A man, unconscious but breathing, bound with rope. She answered the operator's questions quickly and kept her voice level the entire time, the way you talk when you need the person on the other end to understand you clearly and move fast. The operator told her to stay on the line. She told the operator she would, and then she set the phone down beside her on the ground with the call still open and turned her full attention back to the man. She was not going to just sit there and wait. She started with the rope at his ankles because that was what she could reach most easily. The knots were tight and her fingers were cold from the morning air, which made it harder. She worked at them anyway, pressing her nails into the gaps between the rope and trying to find the point where the knot had been started. The place where, if you pulled the right way, the whole thing would begin to give. She had seen her husband tie knots like this years ago, practical working knots, and she remembered enough to know that patience was the only real tool that worked against them. She did not rush her fingers, even though every instinct in her body was telling her to hurry. Rushing would only tighten things further. So she breathed and she worked and she talked. That was the part that surprised even her a little, looking back on it later. She started talking to him even though he was unconscious and could not hear a word she was saying. She talked the way she used to talk to her children when they were small and sick and frightened. A low and steady stream of words that was not really about the content but about the sound. About letting a person know, on whatever level they could still receive it, that they were not alone. She told him she had him. She told him help was coming. She told him he was going to be all right, and that she was right there, and that he did not need to be afraid. She said it over and over in different ways, her voice quiet and even, her fingers working at the rope the entire time. The knot at his ankles loosened first. It took longer than she wanted it to, but it came free eventually, and she unwound the rope carefully, setting it aside. Then she moved around to his wrists, which was harder because of the angle and because the rope there had been tied with more tension, And she started again, working, talking, breathing. At some point during this, he began to stir. It was gradual. A small sound first, barely more than an exhale with a little weight behind it. Then his head moved slightly, tilting to one side. Then his fingers, now freed from the rope at his wrists because she had managed to work that loose too, twitched against the bark of the tree. She watched his face. His eyes moved beneath his closed lids, and then, slowly with what looked like tremendous effort, they opened. He did not know where he was. That was clear immediately. His eyes were open but unfocused, moving around without landing on anything. The kind of look that happens when a mind is trying to reassemble itself from somewhere very far away. Then his gaze found her face and stopped. She could see the moment the fear arrived. His body tensed and he pulled in a sharp breath, and his hands came forward, no longer bound, and she saw immediately that he was about to panic. She did not hesitate. She reached forward and placed both of her hands firmly on either side of his face. Not rough, but deliberate enough to hold his attention. And she looked directly into his eyes and said, clearly and calmly, "Breathe. Just breathe. Look at me and breathe." He stared at her. His chest was heaving. She held his gaze and kept her hands where they were and said it again. "Breathe. You are safe. I have you. Help is coming." She said it with the kind of authority that comes not from position or title, but from being a person who has steadied frightened people before and knows that what a frightened person needs, more than anything in that first moment, is someone who is not afraid. Slowly, his breathing began to even out. His eyes stayed on her face. The tension in his shoulders dropped by degrees. She kept talking. Small things. Practical things. She told him not to try to move too quickly. She told him to keep breathing. She shrugged off her jacket and placed it around his shoulders, tucking it close because his skin was cold to the touch in a way that concerned her. He said something then. His voice was hoarse and barely there, rough from disuse and from what she suspected was hours of exposure to the cold. She leaned closer and asked him to say it again. He said, "Who are you?" She sat back slightly and looked at him, this man she had never seen before in her life, sitting against a tree in the middle of the woods on a cold Tuesday morning, wrapped in her jacket, alive because she had not kept walking when something told her to stop. And she answered him the way she answered most things, plainly, honestly, without any extra decoration. She told him her name. She told him she worked at the estate, just beyond the tree line. And she told him she had found him on her morning walk. He looked at her for a long moment after she said that, his eyes clearer now, more focused, taking her in the way a person does when they are beginning to understand that something important has just happened to them. And then, with what looked like every bit of strength he had left, he said, "Thank you." 2 words. Quiet and raw and entirely real. And Celestin, who never made a fuss about anything, simply nodded and told him to save his energy. Because the sirens she could now hear faintly in the distance were getting closer. And she was going to stay right there beside him until they arrived. The sirens got louder and then stopped, which meant they had reached the estate, and the responders were now making their way on foot through the woods. Celestin could hear voices calling out, organized and directed, moving through the trees in the direction she had come from. She called back. 2 sharp, clear calls so they could find her without wasting time. She kept one hand resting lightly on the man's arm while she did it. Not because he needed to be held down, but because she had noticed that the physical contact seemed to be helping him stay calm. And she was not going to take that away from him in the last few minutes before help arrived. He was more alert now than he had been when he first opened his eyes. His breathing had steadied into something closer to normal, and the wild, disoriented look had faded from his face, replaced by something more present, more aware, though still clearly exhausted and in pain. He had not tried to speak much since that first quiet thank you. He mostly watched her, which she understood. When you have just come back from a place as frightening as wherever he had been, you hold on to whatever feels safe, and you do not let your eyes wander too far from it. She was that anchor for him in those minutes. A stranger in a jacket she had already given away, kneeling in the leaves of a cold forest. And she took that responsibility as seriously as she took everything else in her life. The first responder who pushed through the branches and reached them stopped for just a moment when he took in the scene. Celestin saw his expression shift, that small recalibration that happens when reality does not match what you were expecting to find. He had probably expected to find a person in distress and another person standing over them, looking frightened or flustered. What he found instead was a woman kneeling beside an injured man with the composure of someone who had the situation entirely in hand. He moved quickly after that initial pause, dropping to a knee on the other side of the man and beginning his assessment. And two more responders arrived within seconds behind him, carrying equipment and moving with the efficient urgency of people who are trained for exactly this. Celestin stepped back to give them room. She did not go far. She stood just outside the immediate circle of activity and watched. Her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, she was now feeling more sharply without her jacket. One of the responders glanced at her while working and asked if she was the one who had called it in. She said yes. He nodded and said she had done well, and then turned his attention back to the man. She did not need the acknowledgement, but she noted it the way you note something that is offered sincerely. They worked on him with practiced speed, checking his vitals, assessing the marks left by the rope, getting fluids into him through a line they had brought in a pack. He cooperated as best he could, answering their questions in that rough, barely their voice, wincing when they examined the cut above his eyebrow. At one point, he turned his head and found Celestin in the small crowd that had gathered at the edge of the clearing. And he held her gaze for a moment with an expression she could not fully read, but that felt like more than just gratitude. It felt like recognition, like he was making sure she was still there and committing her face to memory in a way that was deliberate and intentional. She gave him a small nod. He looked away and let the paramedics continue their work. The walk back through the woods to the estate was not long, but it was slow, moving carefully with a stretcher through uneven ground and low branches. And Celestin walked alongside the group without anyone asking her to, and without anyone asking her not to. She had given the lead responder her phone number and her name, and he had told her that someone from the authorities would need to take a full statement from her shortly. She said that was fine. She said she would be wherever they needed her to be. What she did not say, what she kept entirely to herself, was that her hands had finally started shaking. Not during any of it. Not while she was working the rope loose. Not while she was holding his face and telling him to breathe. Not while the responders were asking her questions in clipped, professional tones. But now, walking back through the trees in the cold morning air with the immediate emergency behind her. Her hands were trembling at her sides with the kind of delayed reaction that bodies have when they have been holding themselves tightly together and finally realize the crisis has passed. She pressed them into the pockets of her trousers and kept walking and did not mention it to anyone. By the time they reached the edge of the woods and came out onto the grounds of the estate, there were more vehicles on the long driveway than she had ever seen there at once. 2 ambulances, several police cars, a dark, unmarked vehicle that had the particular look of something official and serious. Her employer was standing near the front steps of the main house in a robe and had clearly been woken by the commotion. And their eyes went wide when they saw Celestin emerge from the tree line with the group of first responders. She answered the look with a small shake of her head that meant she would explain later and kept moving. The man was loaded into the ambulance with quiet efficiency. Just before the doors closed, he turned his head and found her one more time in the small crowd standing on the driveway. She raised her hand slightly. Not a wave exactly, just an acknowledgement. The doors closed and the ambulance pulled away, and Celestine stood on the driveway of the estate, where she had worked for 11 years and let. Out of breath, so long it felt like it had been stored somewhere deep in her chest. Since the moment she had first stepped off the trail. A police officer approached her then, a woman with a calm, direct manner that Celestine appreciated immediately, and asked if she was ready to go through everything from the beginning. Celestine said yes and followed her to one of the vehicles where they sat together, and she told the whole story, start to finish, the same way she did everything, clearly, without exaggeration, without leaving anything out. She described the sound that had stopped her on the path. She described what she had seen when she pushed through the branches. She described the rope and the knots and the way she had worked them loose. She described the moment he had opened his eyes and the moment she had held his face to stop him from panicking. She answered every question that followed, and then answered the follow-up questions after that. And when the officer finally closed her notepad and thanked her for her composure and her quick thinking, Celestine simply said she had done what needed doing. The officer looked at her for a moment with an expression that suggested she wanted to say something more than the professional situation allowed, and then she nodded and let her go. The estate was buzzing for the rest of that day in the way that a place buzzes when something extraordinary has happened just at its edges. The other staff had heard pieces of the story by mid-morning, and the whispers moved through the house quickly and quietly. People found reasons to pass by the kitchen or the hallway where Celestine was working and gave her looks that she received with her usual composure. Not cold, but not encouraging either. She was not someone who needed a fuss made over her. She did her work that day the same as she always did. She managed the schedule. She checked in with the cook about the evening meal. She made sure the east wing was properly aired out before the afternoon. She did not talk about what had happened unless someone asked her directly, and even then she kept her answers brief. What she did do in the late afternoon when the house had quieted and she had a few minutes to herself was call her youngest child to ask how the school presentation had gone. Her child said it had gone well, said the teacher had been impressed, said some of the other kids had asked questions after and it had felt really good. Celestine sat in her small room at the back of the estate, on the edge of her neatly made bed, under the photograph of her children on the nightstand, and she smiled. A real one. Why and quiet and entirely private? Because whatever extraordinary thing had happened that morning in the woods, this was the part that mattered to her. This was the part she had been looking forward to all day. The rest of it, the man in the woods and the rope and the sirens and the police and the statements, all of that was something she had handled because it needed handling. But this, her child's voice on the phone telling her about a good day, this was what she had gotten up for.